You were in the Gestapo in 1944, were you not?
Yes, in Rome, yes. For every German soldier, 10 Italians had to die.
But children were killed.
No, not at all.
14-year-old boys were killed.
Oh.
At the end of the Second World War, when the Third Reich was collapsing and the Nuremberg trials promised justice, a hidden movement was already underway. Thousands of officers, scientists, and high-ranking Nazi officials began disappearing from Europe using false passports and safe conduct documents issued by religious institutions, consulates, and sympathetic governments. While Berlin was reduced to rubble, the ports of Genoa and Barcelona became departure points for a new destination, Juan Domingo Perón's Argentina. Sheltered by the anti-communist discourse and the collaboration of sectors of the Catholic Church, the Argentine government facilitated visas and documentation for humanitarian reasons. Through these routes traveled Adolf Eichmann, the organizer of the deportation of millions of Jews, Erich Priebke, responsible for the Ardeatine Caves massacre, and Josef Mengele, the Auschwitz doctor. All entered with Red Cross passports and the endorsement of Argentine authorities. Between 1946 and 1950, more than 3,000 former members of the Third Reich were admitted to the country, integrating into German communities, industries and schools under new identities. This documentary reveals the political, diplomatic and ecclesiastical network that turned Argentina into the largest refuge for Nazism after the war. The March Flight, the Argentine SS officer who built the Nazi escape route. To understand how the secret network that allowed hundreds of Nazi officials to escape to South America was organized, one must focus on a key figure, Carlos Fuldner. Born in Argentina and an SS officer, his arrival in Europe in the final months of the war and his subsequent return to Buenos Aires explain the origins of the structure that would later facilitate the flight of Third Reich men. In a scenario where Nazi power was crumbling, Fuldner knew how to navigate the remnants of a system seeking to secure a future outside Germany. Amid this collapse, security offices became hotbeds of intrigue and distrust. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, head of the apparatus, and Walter Schellenberg, in charge of foreign espionage, accused each other of hiding funds in Switzerland and Austria to ensure their survival. False documents proliferated, and SS officers fabricated civilian identities to dissociate themselves from their crimes. In this turbulent setting, Fuldner stood out for his ability to establish contacts and offer discreet exits to those who could pay the price. From there, his talent for deception found fertile ground. A polyglot with an extensive network of connections in European commerce, he understood the value of movement and identity. His Argentine origin made him a natural intermediary between German agents and the support networks forming in Madrid. There, in Franco's neutral capital, figures like the Belgian Pierre Day and the French Charles Lescar, both with collaborationist pasts and ties to Nazi intelligence services, shared refuge and contacts with diplomats aligned with the Axis. Little by little, what began as a series of favors transformed into a system. From Spain to Buenos Aires, a carefully woven network extended its reach. In the years that followed, this structure, encouraged by political sympathies in Juan Domingo Perón's government and influential sectors of the church, would enable the clandestine transfer of war criminals from Europe to South America. But it all began with that discreet March 1945 flight, and a man who saw, amid the Reich's collapse, an opportunity to be reborn. This capacity for resurgence had deep roots. When Carlos Fuldner arrived in Madrid, he was no stranger to the world of deception or exile. Years earlier, he had tasted his own medicine. Accused of fraud, desertion, and embezzlement within the SS, he was dishonorably expelled and imprisoned. His skull ring, a symbol of belonging to the corps, was melted down, a humiliation reserved for those deemed unworthy of the black uniform. However, that fall was not final. After his release and partial acquittal of charges, he unsuccessfully tried to regain his rank, and from then on, his life unfolded in the shadows, moving between countries, names, and flags. From that point, his trail became murky. Post-war Allied reports could barely reconstruct his itinerary. It was known that he had traveled through South America, served as a translator in Franco's Blue Division, and returned to Berlin several times. He had also worked for Sofindus, the economic network financing secret German operations in Spain. But even there, his character betrayed him. He was sacked for misappropriation. As the Third Reich collapsed, Fuldner continued to move freely across the continent with suspicious ease, transporting money, documents and, according to some records, shipments of stolen artwork destined for the black market. This constant movement kept him in the spotlight. His return to Madrid in late 1944 coincided with the German intelligence service's final attempts to establish survival networks outside Europe. Having regained his rank and holding Argentine and German passports, Fuldner arrived on a special mission for Himmler's Secret Service. In the following weeks, he met with Reich diplomats and reconnected with old acquaintances, the Belgian Pierre Day and the French journalist Charles Lesker, both Nazi collaborators seeking refuge. The British would later confirm that he belonged to the SD's security service. Under the protection of members of the Francoist aristocracy and former Blue Division comrades, Fuldner hid in private residences and estates near El Escorial. The Spanish police pretended to search for him while he changed addresses, moving between Madrid and Catalonia. He even appeared in social circles, mingling with bullfighters and influential members of high society. Despite Allied pressure, he managed to remain free, solidifying his reputation as a born survivor. In the midst of this web of favors, his true work began. He coordinated actions with other exiled agents, including Charles Lesker, a veteran propagandist also born in Buenos Aires and closely tied to French Nazism. Lesker had fled Paris with false documentation and funds provided by Berlin. From his Madrid residence, he organized the first itineraries to South America, leveraging his contacts with Argentine diplomats and with Perón himself, whom he had known since the 1930s. His network, supported by Francoist sectors and the Church, would become the main escape route for Reich men. At the heart of this mechanism, as an efficient and ambitious executor, was Carlos Fuldner. With Perón's electoral victory in February 1946, the small circle of Nazi exiles in Madrid understood that their moment had arrived. In discreet cafes and apartments guarded by Francoist sympathizers, there was open talk of the imminent evacuation to South America. Charles Lesker, now a central figure in the network, claimed to maintain direct communication with the new Argentine president. He said he had met him in the 1930s during his trips to Buenos Aires, and that their relationship had continued through the Argentine embassy in Madrid. This alleged friendship, whether real or exaggerated, gave a decisive boost to the escape plans that had been secretly developing for months. During those meetings, Lesker shared confidences with the German spy Hans Sommer and the Francoist intelligence chief known as Peña. In gatherings held between San Sebastian and Madrid, they discussed how to extract the most compromised Nazi officers from the country. One of the most urgent cases was that of Luftwaffe General Eckhard Kramer, responsible for transferring a convoy of looted artworks by Goering from France to Spain. After being betrayed, Kramer was hidden on a Spanish officer's estate and eventually shipped to Argentina. Episodes like this demonstrated the effectiveness of a network sustained by complicity within the army and police, who warned fugitives before any raids. The plan was as meticulous as it was bold. According to Allied reports, between 150 and 200 Germans would be shipped from southern Spain, specifically Cádiz, using false passports and documents issued by Francoist authorities themselves. The first trips began in the summer of 1946, just as news of priests and deserter sailors arriving in Buenos Aires, actually former SD and Gestapo members, started to emerge. The first to test the route was another German-Argentine agent, Carlos Reuter, a supposed banker with a background in German intelligence. Captured in Paris and released thanks to his Argentine passport, he took refuge in Madrid, where Lesker entrusted him with the mission of inaugurating the escape route. He departed from northern Spain, Bilbao, in early 1946 and disembarked in Buenos Aires days before Perón's victory. His smooth journey confirmed that the operation could work on a large scale. By mid-1946, Lesker decided to follow the same path. After bidding farewell to his collaborators in Madrid, he traveled to the Basque Country and embarked for the Americas. Although briefly detained in Uruguay at France's request, he managed to continue his journey and soon settled in Buenos Aires. There, from a discreet apartment on Santa Fe Avenue, he continued operating under the protection of his old acquaintance in the Casa Rosada. Around him, the nucleus of a broader network began to form, one that would soon assume new leadership, that of Pierre Day, the next architect of the Nazi exile in the southern continent. When Pierre Day stepped off the plane in Buenos Aires on May 21, 1947, he was closing a journey that encapsulated much of the clandestine history of fleeing Nazism. This Belgian journalist, intellectual and diplomat, who had met Hitler, Ribbentrop and Pius XII, arrived in the Rio de la Plata under a modified identity, sheltered by a regime willing to offer refuge to the Reich's defeated. But his journey was, in reality, the culmination of a much broader process, the transformation of a European collaborator into an essential piece of a network of exiles weaving ties between Madrid and Buenos Aires. During the German occupation, Day had moved without scruples between Otto Abetz's offices in Paris and the most anti-Semitic editorial rooms of the French press. At Je suis partout, surrounded by figures like Robert Brasillach or Lucien Rebatté, he casually observed how propaganda celebrating Jewish persecution became state policy. Between inflammatory columns and dinners at Maxim's, Day found in that environment a mix of fascination and power, convinced he was part of a new European order. But when the war's tide turned irreversible, that world began to crumble. In 1943, already a sports minister in the Belgian collaborationist government, he traveled to Rome and was received by Pius XII. He sought to know which of the two totalitarianisms, Nazi or Soviet, the Church considered less harmful. He received no clear answers. The Vatican moved cautiously, avoiding definitions that could compromise its neutrality. For Day, that ambiguity was the definitive sign that the fascist structure was cracking. When the Allies landed in Normandy, he understood that staying in Europe would be impossible. Taking refuge in Madrid since 1944, he integrated into the same circles that already included Charles Lesker, Carlos Fuldner, and Radu Genia. In the salons of the Hotel Palace or at the tables of the Horka restaurant, former diplomats, propagandists, and Axis officers mingled, dreaming of rebuilding their careers across the Atlantic. Day, aware of his growing isolation, began acting as a mediator for Belgians and French, pursued by justice, managing safe conducts and contacts with Spanish authorities. That activity unwittingly turned him into another link in the future Argentine route. As the trials for collaboration progressed in Brussels, his situation became untenable. In December 1946, he was sentenced to death in absentia, stripped of his citizenship, and monitored by the international press. From his room at the Hotel Victoria, he wrote in his diary about the feeling of a slow disappearance, friends distancing themselves, favors denied, and doors no longer opening. Only a few Spanish intellectuals, among them Eugenio Dors and the Marquis of Las Marismas, offered him refuge and connected him with Argentine representatives close to Perón. Thanks to this network of influences and the intervention of the diplomat Raoul de la Bougle, Day finally obtained a visa. On the 8th of May 1947, with a stateless passport and a new surname adapted to Spanish, he boarded a flight south. His journey made stops in Morocco, West Africa, and Montevideo before landing in Buenos Aires. There, Lesker and other Axis exiles, already settled under the protection of the new Peronist government, awaited him. As he walked across the tarmac at Morón airfield, Day breathed the warm air of the southern winter. He had escaped the European judicial net and unknowingly was about to become a key cog in a system that, in the years to come, would shelter hundreds of Nazi fugitives. From his arrival, the network that Fuldner and Lesker had set in motion began to take its final shape. The true rescue operation was just beginning. From Rome to Buenos Aires, the sacred network that saved the Nazis. When Pierre Day landed in Buenos Aires in May 1947, a silent network had already prepared his arrival. The escape route that facilitated the passage of Third Reich fugitives to South America was not merely a political or logistical effort, it also had an ecclesiastical face. In the preceding months, the Vatican and the Argentine Church had actively intervened to establish these pathways. From Rome to Genoa, through the Vatican archives and Italian ports, priests, diplomats and cardinals forged a humanitarian corridor that, under the pretext of Christian charity, served to hide collaborators and war criminals. The turning point came in January 1946, when the Bishop of Rosario, Antonio Caggiano, traveled to Italy. His official destination was the Vatican, where Pope Pius XII would elevate him to the rank of cardinal. However, his parallel mission was to strengthen ties between the Argentine Church and European Catholic leaders committed to the anti-communist cause. He was accompanied by Agustin Barrera, Bishop of Tucumán, a veteran of Catholic nationalism and a fervent opponent of the Masonic and Red conspiracy that, according to him, threatened the faith in South America. In Genoa, the prelates were received by the Argentine consul Aquilino López, a former collaborator of German intelligence services. His presence was no coincidence. López was a key intermediary facilitating the cardinal's movements in Italy. Shortly afterward, Caggiano fell ill and was admitted to a clinic in Rome, but his convalescence became a period of intense and discreet activity. In late March, he visited the Pontifical Commission for Assistance, an organization that officially managed documents for refugees, but in practice issued false identities to help former Nazis and collaborators escape to Argentina. During this time, Caggiano and Barrera met with Cardinal Eugène Tisserand, the Vatican's expert on Russian affairs and a leading advocate of the fight against communism. From that meeting emerged a tacit agreement. Peronist Argentina was willing to receive Europeans whose political stance during the war exposed them to reprisals, that is, the defeated Nazis. For Tisserand, who saw the Soviet Union as an imminent threat to Europe, these men represented a valuable contingent of ideological fighters. This pact of convenience offered refuge to those who could contribute anti-communist fervor and experience, while the Church secured its influence in a world it feared losing to Soviet materialism. After his stay in Rome, Cardinal Caggiano became the key figure in a diplomatic and ecclesiastical apparatus designed to ensure the escape of hundreds of European collaborators. During March and April 1946, the Argentine embassy in Rome began receiving a series of special recommendations signed by the prelate. Through the Vatican, these requests translated into visas issued with unusual speed. The beneficiaries presented themselves as French tourists or refugees, but many were in reality war criminals seeking to disappear. After being invested as a cardinal, Caggiano traveled to Francoist Spain, where his visit took on a triumphal character. Behind the scenes, arrangements were finalized for new expeditions of fugitives. When the ship Cabo de Buena Esperanza sailed from Cadiz on the 9th of May 1946, among its passengers was the aeronautical engineer Émile de Watine, wanted in France for collaborating with the Third Reich. He arrived in Buenos Aires and joined Perón's military aviation project, marking the beginning of a steady flow of exiles. As the rescue network expanded, its complexity surpassed even the capacity of Perón's intelligence apparatus and the Nazi agents operating in Europe. Thousands of fugitives, Reich officers, Vichy collaborators, Ustasha members and Belgian Reichists relied on a structure where diplomatic resources, ecclesiastical aid and hidden funds intertwined. Only the Church, with its institutional reach and moral authority, could orchestrate such a project without immediately raising suspicions. Rome became the heart of this system, where Croatian roots, Carlos Fuldner's operations, and Pierre Day's structure in Buenos Aires converged. A key figure in this machinery was Monsignor Alois Hudal, an Austrian bishop and rector of the Santa Maria dell'Anima Church, the spiritual home of the German community in Rome. An open admirer of Hitler, Hudal possessed the golden badge of the Nazi Party. In 1948, from his office on Via della Pace, he wrote to Juan Domingo Perón requesting 5,000 visas for German and Austrian soldiers, whom he described as anti-communist fighters who had saved Europe from Soviet domination. Behind this rhetoric was a contingent of former Reich members, many with pending war crime charges. Hudal began organizing his network in 1944 when he took charge of the Austrian section of the Pontifical Commission for Assistance. Officially intended to aid refugees, this organization became a channel for protecting fugitive Nazis. Part of its funding came from American Catholic organizations that saw humanitarian aid as a way to counter communist expansion in Europe. Among Hudal's collaborators were the Croatian priest Krunoslav Draganović, a specialist in document forgery, and Captain Reinhard Kops, a former German army intelligence officer. Fugitives were housed in convents, provided with false identities and sent from Genoa to South America with Red Cross passports. Hudal himself later admitted in his memoirs that he considered it his duty to help the persecuted and save from vengeance those who had served National Socialism. For hundreds of men, Rome became a sanctuary. Under the protection of cassocks and ecclesiastical seals, the survivors of the Third Reich found in the Vatican's walls the gateway to their final destination, South America. The port of Genoa became the last stop on the Nazi exile route. There, among guarded docks and makeshift offices, fugitives from across Europe converged. Devastated by bombings, the port city provided an ideal setting for clandestine activities. Under the protection of the local church and the Pontifical Commission for Assistance, Nazis found refuge, documents, and a ticket to the south. Behind this network was Archbishop Giuseppe Siri, a young but influential prelate who had founded the National Committee for Emigration to Argentina and the Auxilium organization. Both entities, presented as charitable initiatives, became the main channel for transferring anti-Bolsheviks to South America, a term that in practice included fascists, Ustashas, and former Reich officers. The system was precise. Fugitives arrived in Genoa from Rome or Trieste with the help of priests like the Croatian Karlo Petranović, an Auxilium representative and Draganovic's collaborator. Petranović himself was a war criminal who had overseen executions and participated in the persecution of thousands of Serbs. Despite Yugoslavia's extradition requests, the British protected him, aware that his network served broader interests. From his residence, Petranović organized shipments to Buenos Aires using false identities issued by the Red Cross and backed by documents from Caritas Croata, a seal guaranteeing direct Vatican intervention. Among those who escaped were the highest-ranking leaders of the Croatian fascist government. Meanwhile, Perón had prepared the ground from Rome. His Argentine immigration delegation in Europe, led by the priest José Clemente Silva, operated in coordination with Vatican circles. Officially dedicated to attracting European labor, the office served as a covert channel for special cases, the so-called Greys, Axis collaborators whose transfer had the tacit consent of Washington and London. The line between the guilty and the redeemed blurred, and under this ambiguity, hundreds of fugitives sailed south. By the late 1940s, the rescue machinery had reached a transcontinental scale. Among the most wanted criminals who used these routes was SS Captain Walter Kuchman, responsible for the massacre of thousands of Jews in Poland. After the Third Reich's collapse, he hid in Spain, where he had fought with the Phalange during the Civil War. Pursued by his own comrades for corruption, he took refuge in a Carmelite monastery in Madrid and adopted a new identity, the friar Pedro Olmo. With the help of Spanish authorities, he obtained authentic religious documents and a passport and sailed to Buenos Aires in January 1948. Once in Argentina, Kuchman received immediate support from the presidential circle, securing a taxi license and a managerial position at the German company Osram. His social circle included other former SS members, many of whom had also been aided by Bishop Alois Hudal. Kuchman's case was not unique. In the following years, other notorious criminals followed the same path. Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, Hans Fischbuck, finance minister of occupied Holland, and Franz Stangl, commander of Treblinka. All received direct assistance from priests within the Pontifical Commission for Assistance. Even when the Vatican officially denied its involvement, ecclesiastical signatures and seals repeatedly appeared in Red Cross archives. Perón, the Freude family, and the hidden power behind the Nazi rescue. When the fugitives of the Reich began arriving in Buenos Aires, the network woven between Rome and Genoa had fulfilled its purpose. In Argentina, ecclesiastical protection found its political counterpart, Juan Domingo Perón's project. Years later, from his exile in Madrid, Perón himself attempted to explain the reasons that led him to offer refuge to the defeated. He recorded lengthy reflections on a tape recorder, presenting himself as a soldier betrayed by history. His words, harsh and measured, revealed his conviction that the Nuremberg trials had been an affront to military honor. He claimed to have felt shame watching German officers judged by the victorious powers, convinced that the Allies had acted without the dignity of victors. This perception led him to justify what he had publicly denied for years, the deliberate decision to rescue persecuted Nazis. These recordings, dictated in solitude shortly before his triumphant return to Argentina in 1973, constituted his final political testament. Shortly after entrusting them to the Spanish actress Nini Montián, Perón died, leaving behind not only the legacy of a popular leader, but also the shadow of an international network that had saved hundreds of war criminals. The transcripts of those tapes, published in Madrid in 1976, confirmed what history already suspected. The protection of Nazis was not a diplomatic accident, but a state policy. Behind this machinery was the general's inner circle, a small group of men whose loyalty combined ideology and self-interest. Among them stood out Rodolfo Freude, a young man of German-Argentine origin who had earned Perón's trust when he was still a colonel. Freude was no ordinary official. As head of the Bureau of Information, the presidency's intelligence office, he served as a liaison between the government and the network of European exiles. In national archives, images remain of him accompanying Perón and Eva Duarte at official events, always one step behind, discreet but ever present. His closeness was such that Evita came to distrust him, fearing his shadowy influence threatened the couple's intimacy. This suspicion was not unfounded. The services under Freude's command handled sensitive information and controlled a network of agents operating in both Buenos Aires and Europe. His father, Ludwig Freude, had been one of the main financial intermediaries of the Third Reich in Argentina during the war. An influential businessman, he had channeled German funds into Perón's 1945 presidential campaign. The US Embassy considered him a liaison agent between the German community and Nazi intelligence services. From his mansion in Belgrano, Ludwig hosted diplomats, military officers, and businessmen linked to the Hitler regime. After Germany's defeat, the Allies demanded his repatriation, but Perón blocked the measure with political maneuvers and false documents. The protection of the Freude family marked the beginning of an alliance that would prove fundamental in the years to come. In 1945, as Buenos Aires grappled with international pressure and internal protests against military authoritarianism, Perón prepared for his own battle. Street unrest reflected the tension between democratic sectors and the pro-German nationalism still lingering in the military. In this context, the friendship with Ludwig Freude proved decisive. When the Allies demanded his arrest, Perón ordered that he be placed under house arrest instead of deportation. The expulsion order, according to later testimony, was removed from police archives by a Peronist agent and destroyed in Freud's own fireplace. Loyalty had been sealed with fire. In the following months, the relationship between Perón and the Freude family transformed into a political and financial partnership. Rudi, the son, became Perón's personal secretary and later head of intelligence for the new government. From his office in the Casa Rosada, he coordinated the arrival of European refugees and managed the president's reserved funds. Ludwig, meanwhile, served as a liaison with German capital seeking refuge in South America. US reports described him as one of the leaders of the movement to place Reich assets in safe locations. The apparatus consolidated between 1946 and 1947 united diverse interests: the protection of ideological allies, the incorporation of German technicians, and the creation of a modern intelligence system under presidential control. Colonel Perón, now president, delegated to Freude the task of organizing this apparatus. His office absorbed functions of the political police and the military, becoming a parallel network answerable only to him. Each week, Freude presented reports on internal opposition, the labor movement, and the activities of European immigrants. In parallel, he worked closely with the immigration commissioner Santiago Peralta, a military anthropologist who promoted a policy of racial selection to populate the country. Peralta represented the bridge between nationalist ideology and the pseudo-scientific racism inherited from Nazism. From the Commission on Human Potential, created under his direction, he pushed a plan to purify Argentina's social body by preventing the formation of foreign minorities. His language, steeped in eugenics and anti-Semitism, found resonance in military circles that saw communism as the ultimate enemy. Under this ideological framework, the moral justification was built for receiving thousands of politically compromised Europeans. The official discourse spoke of reconstruction and progress. The reality was one of refuge and concealment. Starting in 1946, the first agents sent from Madrid began to arrive, many of them fugitives convicted in their countries of origin. Carlos Fuldner, as we saw earlier, was one of the pillars of this network. Recruited by Freude, he was tasked with managing the arrival of German technicians and specialists, though his true mission was to organize the escape of war criminals. In coordination with Pierre Day and ecclesiastical networks in Europe, Fuldner established a transit circuit that began in Genoa and ended in Buenos Aires. Under his supervision, men like Adolf Eichmann, Josef Mengele, and Erich Priebke found refuge in Argentina with false identities. The structure was so efficient that in less than 2 years, Buenos Aires became one of the main destinations for Axis fugitives. In the immigration records of 1947, names of engineers, doctors, pilots, and officials from collaborationist regimes appear. Behind each file was a story of coordinated cover-up involving embassies, intelligence services, and Vatican agents. Freude, Fuldner, and Peralta formed the operational core in Argentina, while intermediaries like Branco Benzon, Jacques de Mailleux, or Gino Monti de Valsacina, all with proven Nazi pasts, operated from Europe. Meetings at the Casa Rosada confirmed the institutional nature of the project. Later testimonies revealed encounters in which Perón personally received several of these fugitives. In December 1947, 3 men sentenced to death in Europe, Pierre Day, René Lagrue, and Georges Guilbeault, were introduced into his office by Rodolfo Freude. At the same table sat Carlos Fuldner, Radu Guernea, and Victor de la Serna, a Spanish journalist linked to the Falange. They discussed mechanisms to facilitate new arrivals and regularize the status of those already in the country. According to Day, Perón knew the past of each one and received them with the serenity of someone acting out of political conviction. The support of the Argentine state was not limited to protection. The newcomers obtained jobs, contracts, and access to official institutions. Fuldner joined the Ministry of the Interior. Benzon became an advisor to the Ministry of Health. Mahieu held a position at the Higher School of Political Leadership. Public resources funded their activities, and many participated in the ideological training of Peronist cadres. In that environment, the line between nationalism, Catholicism, and fascism became blurred. The official rhetoric of social justice coexisted with the exaltation of order and discipline represented by the Reich's refugees. The German influence was also reflected in the economic sphere. Part of the capital transferred from Europe was channeled into Argentine banks and state-owned companies, strengthening the financial independence that Perón proclaimed as a goal. US intelligence reports warned of operations aimed at hiding Nazi assets, managed by Ludwig Freude and other businessmen in the presidential circle. These maneuvers, shielded by the import substitution policy, allowed European capital to be reintegrated without raising public suspicion. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Nuremberg trials progressed. For Perón, those proceedings symbolized the triumph of communism under an Allied mask. In his speeches, he criticized the victors' revenge and defended the need for reconciliation. That discourse justified, to the Argentine public, the arrival of European immigrants without distinction of ideologies. In practice, the immigration policy favored former Nazis and collaborators, while Jewish refugees faced bureaucratic obstacles and explicit rejections. Peralta had warned that groups forming separate communities should not be admitted, a euphemism that, in official documents, equated to not admitting Jews. The rescue machinery remained active until the early 1950s. With the collaboration of the Vatican and European governments, Perón's Argentina became a sanctuary. The fugitives integrated into industry, the military and public administration. Some adopted new identities, others kept their names, protected by the immunity offered by the regime. The network functioned as an extension of Peronist foreign policy, anti-communist, Catholic, and strategically ambiguous toward Western powers. In recordings from his later years, Perón recalled those times with a mix of pride and resentment. He claimed to have acted out of honor, not sympathy for Nazism, but rejection of how the victors treated the defeated. However, documentary evidence shows his decision was also pragmatic. The men he rescued brought technology, contacts, and money to his government. In the logic of power, morality was subordinate to political calculation. From Germany to Bariloche, the hidden lives of Eichmann and Priebke in Argentina. By the late 1940s, the escape network had reached operational maturity. Diplomatic contacts, ecclesiastical routes, and legalization mechanisms functioned with near-military precision. In this context, Adolf Eichmann's story illustrates the extent to which this machinery operated effectively. The organizer of the deportation of millions of Jews to concentration camps, Eichmann embodied the bureaucratic essence of the extermination. He was also one of the last major criminals to take advantage of the protection offered by Peronist Argentina. His arrival, 2 years after Erich Priebke's, revealed that the network remained active, perfecting every detail of the transit between a devastated Europe and the new continent that promised anonymity. Since 1948, while Carlos Fuldner coordinated operations at the Immigration Bureau in Genoa, Adolf Eichmann's name was already listed in Argentine records. His file, processed almost simultaneously with those of Josef Mengele and Erich Priebke, bore the number 231,489/48 and was handled by the same intermediaries. Unlike Priebke, who traveled as Otto Pape, Eichmann received a carefully crafted identity, that of Ricardo Clement, a German technician with no past. The definitive document was issued by the Red Cross in June 1950 with the collaboration of a Franciscan priest in Genoa, Father Eduardo de Murta, assisted by Bishop Alois Hudal. Both worked with refugees, though their compassion was selectively directed toward those who had served the Third Reich. Hudal, known for his affinity with Nazism, admitted years later to having helped more than 40 Germans escape for humanitarian reasons. Eichmann left Europe on the ship Giovanna C., which sailed from the port of Genoa on June 17, 1950. On deck, a photograph shows him smiling, dressed in a light suit and hat, accompanied by 2 other men. He declared himself a technician and traveled with a Red Cross passport. Among the passengers was also Herbert Kuhlmann, former commander of the Hitler Youth Panzer Division, who in Buenos Aires would transform into the businessman Pedro Geller. Both had received the same assistance from Fuldner, who not only provided them with visas, but also lodging and employment upon arrival. Eichmann's arrival in Buenos Aires coincided with the consolidation of the intelligence apparatus led by Rodolfo Freude from the Casa Rosada. On behalf of President Perón, this office had turned the entry of former Nazis into a semi-official operation, protected by amnesty decrees and a compliant bureaucracy. In August 1950, Eichmann presented himself at the Foreigners Registry with his newly issued Argentine document and received identity card number 1,378,538. It included his photo, fingerprints, and new name. The metamorphosis was complete. Under the cover of the Capri Company, supposedly dedicated to hydroelectric studies in the province of Tucumán, Eichmann and Kuhlmann began working as technical employees. Capri was a front created by Fuldner with state funds, serving as a labor refugee for newcomers with compromised pasts. Its payroll included former SS officers and Nazi party members who arrived with little knowledge of Spanish but plenty of recommendations. Among them were Siegfried Uberreither, former governor of Styria, engineer Armin Schoklich, former rector of the Graz University of Technology, and other names associated with the Reich's administration. the company functioned as a meeting point for those seeking to rebuild their lives under new identities, far from European tribunals. Eichmann himself, now Clement, led a disciplined existence. He accompanied Austrian engineers on fieldwork and drafted technical reports under Professor Schocklich's supervision. His discretion was proverbial. His name never appeared in the University of Tucumán's records, but several witnesses recalled his presence in the hallways, speaking French with professors and admiring the northern Argentine landscape. This routine continued until 1952, when he managed to bring his wife and 3 children from Austria. They traveled on the ship Salter, using their real names, and were received at the port by collaborators of the network. The family reunion marked the end of total anonymity. Ricardo Clement's life was beginning to intertwine again with that of Eichmann. Gradually, the Capri project crumbled. Argentina's economy suffered the effects of the crisis following Eva Perón's death, and the government reduced public contracts. Fuldner's company lost support, and many of its employees were reassigned or dismissed. Eichmann moved to Buenos Aires, renting a house at Chacabuco Street, 4261, in the suburb of Olivos. His former companion Kuhlmann, however, prospered. Transformed into a businessman, he settled in a luxurious residence in Palermo Chico, near the presidential headquarters. Their relationship deteriorated. According to later testimonies, Kuhlmann boasted in private gatherings about knowing the true identity of his former colleague and having brought the pig Eichmann to the country. This enmity sealed the fugitives' definitive isolation. During the 1950s, Eichmann took on various modest jobs. He washed cars, managed a rabbit farm, and later worked in a gas appliance workshop. His children grew up in a normal environment, attending German schools, while their father maintained the same daily rigor he had during the Reich. He read, wrote, and according to some acquaintances, took an interest in science fiction, a form of escapism that contrasted with the gravity of his past. But his anonymity was not complete. Within German immigrant circles, his identity was known. Some sought him out of curiosity, others out of admiration or a mere desire to belong to that vanished world. In this environment, Eichmann reconnected with old comrades: Otto Skorzeny, Mussolini's rescuer; Reinhard Kops, who had organized escape routes from Rome; and Willem Sassen, a Dutch journalist based in Buenos Aires who would become his confidant. It was Sassen who convinced him to narrate his version of the events. Between 1956 and 1957, Eichmann sat in front of a tape recorder with Sassen and a small group of listeners, among them the former officer Rudolf Mildner, to reconstruct his role in the final solution. For months, they recorded more than 60 audio tapes and produced a transcript exceeding 700 pages. In those sessions, held in houses on the outskirts of Buenos Aires, Eichmann spoke with bureaucratic coldness. He justified his actions as following orders, but in some passages he revealed pride in the efficiency with which he had carried out the deportations. Those recordings, which Sassen later tried to sell to the press, would years later become one of the most compelling pieces of evidence presented at the Jerusalem trial. Life in Buenos Aires continued its course. Eichmann changed jobs again and began working at the Mercedes-Benz factory in González Catán. There he blended in with Argentine workers and maintained a meticulous routine. No one suspected that the quiet man who took the bus daily had been one of the architects of the Holocaust. However, the network that had protected him was beginning to unravel. After Perón's overthrow in 1955, former official contacts scattered. Some, like Freude and Fuldner, retained influence in the shadows. Others left the country, but the system of complicity that had ensured his safety started to show cracks. Meanwhile, Europe resumed pending trials. Investigations into Eichmann's whereabouts remained open, and his name occasionally appeared in intelligence reports without anyone knowing for certain where he was hiding. The definitive lead came from an unexpected source: Lothar Hermann, a blind German refugee living in the Buenos Aires province. His daughter Sylvia had befriended one of Eichmann's sons and overheard anti-Semitic comments and allusions to his father's military past at their home. Hermann wrote to the West German authorities in 1957, describing the suspect and his address in Olivos. His letter reached the hands of prosecutor Fritz Bauer, who understood the significance of the discovery and immediately informed Israeli services. The first agent sent to Buenos Aires dismissed the information. It seemed impossible to him that a war criminal would live in a modest suburban house, but Bauer insisted, and a second mission confirmed the details. 2 years later, the Mossad prepared a covert operation to capture the fugitive. On the night of May 11, 1960, as he returned from work, Eichmann was intercepted on a dusty street in the San Fernando neighborhood. He was bundled into a car and taken to a house where he was kept bound for 10 days. There, Israeli agents verified his identity through photographs and testimonies. Finally, he was smuggled out of the country disguised in an El Al airline crew uniform. The news of his capture caused an international uproar. Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion announced in Parliament that Adolf Eichmann was detained in Jerusalem and would face trial. In Buenos Aires, the official reaction was one of indignation. The Argentine government protested to the United Nations, claiming a violation of sovereignty. However, this protest carried a moral ambiguity. The same authorities demanding respect for their laws had facilitated the arrival of Eichmann and many others. Among the fugitives' most fervent defenders was Cardinal Antonio Caggiano, who declared that the Christian duty was to forgive. Others, like diplomat Mario Amadeo, recalled that Argentina had offered refuge to both Jews and Germans, attempting to equate victims and perpetrators. In the weeks that followed, Eichmann's family vanished. His older sons sought help from their father's old comrades, and some nationalist groups promised to rescue him. Rumors circulated of plans to kidnap the Israeli ambassador or attack the embassy. None materialized. When the trial began in Jerusalem, the world heard for the first time the voice of the bureaucrat who had managed death from an office. His testimony, cold and meticulous, revealed the administrative face of the genocide. The Buenos Aires recordings were presented as evidence. In them, Eichmann corrected data and figures, more concerned with statistical accuracy than human suffering. In 1962, he was sentenced to death. His final words included a salute to Germany, Austria, and Argentina, the three countries that had shaped his life. In Buenos Aires, some nationalist sectors organized masses in his memory. Shortly after, a pair of young Jewish women were kidnapped and tortured. One of them was found dead. The symbols of hatred continued to circulate, like an echo refusing to fade. Eichmann's story, in a way, closed the cycle that had begun with the arrival of the first fugitives in 1946. His capture exposed that the protection network, built by religious figures, diplomats, and military officials, was not a myth, but a real and effective structure. At its center were the same names: Freude, Fuldner, Peralta, and Hudal. That capture marked a turning point. Eichmann's trial not only revealed the bureaucratic logic of the extermination, but also the escape routes that, with the support of Bishop Alois Hudal and former agents like Carlos Fuldner and Ludwig Freude, had transported dozens of Nazis to South America. After his execution, many of those men realized their protection was crumbling. Some fled to Paraguay or Chile, others erased their traces and changed their names. Among those who managed to remain hidden, one stood out for his meticulousness and the coldness with which he had served the regime. His name was Erich Priebke. An SS officer, he had worked at the German embassy in Rome as an assistant to Herbert Kappler, the head of the Gestapo in the Italian capital. That seemingly diplomatic post had placed him at the very heart of Nazi repression. From his office on Via Tasso, then converted into a detention and torture center, Priebke oversaw interrogations, arrests, and executions. Orders came from Berlin, but their execution depended on men like him. Rome had been under German occupation since 1943, following Mussolini's fall and the arrival of Reich troops. The former polyglot waiter, who had translated for Hitler during his Vatican visit, transformed into a meticulous officer tasked with maintaining control over a city resisting from the underground. In the makeshift cells of Via Tasso, dozens of prisoners, partisans, communists, and Jews, scratched farewell messages into the walls with nails. "Long live Italy," some wrote, unaware that the echo of those words would outlast their lives. On March 23, 1944, an attack altered the course of events. A communist partisan unit ambushed a German company on Via Rasella, killing 33 soldiers. Hitler's response was immediate. For each German killed, 10 Italians were to be executed. The calculation was swift, the method ruthless. From his office, Priebke helped compile the list of the 330 condemned to death. He reviewed files, added names of untried detainees, and, when prisoners were scarce, included 73 Jews awaiting deportation. That night, the administrative task of death became routine. The next day, the prisoners were taken to the outskirts of Rome, to old quarries known as the Ardeatine Caves. There, starting at 3 in the afternoon, the execution began. The men were brought in groups of 5, hands bound, and lined up before German officers. Priebke, according to his own testimony to the Allies 2 years later, shot 2 of them with an Italian submachine gun. By nightfall, the cave floor was covered with bodies. 335 were counted, 5 more than Hitler had ordered. Fearing witnesses, Kappler decided to eliminate those 5 as well. Then he ordered the entrance sealed with explosives. During the occupation, Rome remained silent. After liberation, the caves became a symbol of horror. In the post-war trials, Kappler was sentenced to life imprisonment. Priebke, however, escaped. He was briefly arrested in 1945 and held in the British camp at Rimini, but took advantage of the chaos at the war's end. On New Year's Eve 1946, while the guards celebrated drunkenly, he cut through the perimeter wire and fled with other prisoners. He found refuge in northern Italy, under the protection of clergy members. From then on, his fate intertwined with the escape network connecting monasteries, consulates, and humanitarian organizations. In Rome, the Pontifical Commission for Assistance issued documents with the Vatican's seal to thousands of displaced persons. Among them was a Red Cross passport in the name of Otto Pape, dated July 26, 1948. Behind that identity hid Priebke. The document had been facilitated by Bishop Alois Hudal, known for his sympathy toward the Nazis and for aiding other Reich fugitives. With that paper in hand, Priebke traveled to Genoa, where a carefully arranged connection awaited. At the DAIE, the Argentine immigration delegation in Europe, his file was processed alongside that of Josef Mengele, the Auschwitz doctor. Both received consecutive permits to enter the Republic of Argentina. On October 23, 1948, the steamship San Giorgio departed from the port of Genoa. On board, the passenger Otto Pape, listed as a butler, traveled in third class with his wife and 2 children. 3 weeks later, he disembarked in Buenos Aires. The network that saved him operated with near-bureaucratic precision. Argentine immigration authorities accepted Vatican-issued documents, the Argentine consulate stamped visas, and upon arrival, refugees were received by contacts linked to Rodolfo Freude and Carlos Fuldner. Priebke started from the bottom, washing dishes in a Buenos Aires hotel. Soon he found work as a waiter at the Adam restaurant, frequented by the German community. In 1949, Perón's government issued a decree regularizing the status of foreigners who had entered with irregular documentation. It required only 2 witnesses and minimal proof of residence. Under this amnesty, Otto Pape reclaimed his true name. The file, dated October 6th, openly described his past at the German embassy in Rome and noted that he had arrived through the intercession of Catholic organizations. The Argentine official who signed the authorization asked no questions. In the years that followed, Priebke led a quiet life. In 1954, he settled with his family in San Carlos de Bariloche, a mountain town surrounded by lakes and forests, where many German exiles had found refuge. There, he opened a small deli called Vienna and fully integrated into the local community. Over time, he became the director of the German school and president of the German-Argentine Cultural Association. Known as Don Erico, he was a friendly and respected neighbor. Few in Bariloche were unaware of his past, but no one questioned it. In a country that had made amnesia a form of stability, his story blended seamlessly with those of countless other European immigrants. Meanwhile, in Italy, the memory of the Ardeatine Caves remained alive. Kappler died in prison, and the military tribunals kept the case against his former assistant open, though inactive. No one seemed interested in pursuing him. Priebke traveled frequently to Europe, renewed his passport at the German embassy in Buenos Aires, and maintained correspondence with former comrades. To intelligence services, he was just another name among the many who had vanished after the war. Everything changed in 1994. A team from the American network ABC's primetime program arrived in Bariloche investigating the presence of another fugitive, former officer Reinhard Kops. When journalist Sam Donaldson inquired about him, someone pointed to Priebke. They found him one ordinary morning, leaving his house, and approached him with a camera rolling. The elderly man, with an upright posture and calm gaze, did not shy away from the questions. He admitted to participating in the Rome massacre and stated without hesitation that he had shot 2 men. "An order is an order," he said in impeccable English. That phrase, recorded on a quiet Patagonian street, reached the entire world. The reaction was immediate. Italy requested his extradition, and after months of proceedings, in 1995, Priebke was transferred to Rome. He was 82 years old. In the trials that followed, he appeared cooperative but detached, insisting he had followed orders and denying any sense of guilt. The church once again offered him shelter, housing him in a monastery while his legal situation was resolved. Finally, in 1998, he was sentenced to life imprisonment, to be served under house arrest. In Bariloche, the news caused astonishment. Many neighbors remembered the affable man who ran the school and greeted everyone on the street. Few paused to consider that this same man had participated in one of the most brutal crimes committed during the German occupation of Italy. His life, woven with silences and complicities, was also a reflection of an era when Argentina had opened its doors to Europe's darkest past. From then on, his story became forever tied to the memory of the 20th century. Priebke died in Rome in 2013 at the age of 100 while serving house arrest for the Ardeatine Caves massacre. In those final years, the networks that had protected him for decades began to be revealed. Journalistic investigations, declassified Vatican documents, and Argentine immigration archives exposed a coordinated system of escape and cover-up that had allowed dozens of Nazis to find refuge in South America. The silence of the archive, how the state erased its tracks. While Erich Priebke served his sentence in Rome, international attention shifted to the country that had sheltered him for nearly half a century. In Argentina, journalists and historians began tracing the documentary evidence of the network that had enabled his entry. What they found was not an abundance of proof, but a meticulous void. The archives that should have recorded the movements of Reich fugitives were incomplete, restricted, or had vanished. The Argentine state, which had acted as a refuge during the post-war period, seemed determined to erase the traces of its involvement. The heart of this story was the General Immigration Archive, located next to the old Immigrants Hotel in the port of Buenos Aires. That building had been, since the late 19th century, the gateway for millions of Europeans seeking a new beginning. In the 1940s, its offices also received thousands of Germans, Austrians, and Croats under special visas. There, their arrivals were recorded, files were opened, and copies of permits issued in Europe by the Argentine immigration delegation were archived. In theory, each immigrant had a complete file, personal information, photographs, recommendation letters, and the signature of the official who authorized their entry. In practice, the documents related to Nazi refugees had vanished. The first suspicions about this disappearance emerged in the early 1990s, when a presidential decree announced the opening of archives related to Nazism. Despite the order, actual access never materialized. Researchers requesting the files of Adolf Eichmann, Josef Mengele, or Erich Priebke received vague responses. Officials claimed the records were in the process of cataloging or had deteriorated over time. No explanation accounted for why the most historically significant archives were precisely the ones missing. The most consistent accounts pointed to the Bureau of Information, the presidential intelligence service created by Rodolfo Freude during Perón's first government. In its offices, located a few blocks from the Casa Rosada, internal surveillance operations and contacts with the network of European exiles were centralized. Several testimonies indicated that a parallel copy of the most sensitive immigration files was kept there. These archives, informally known as Perón's Odessa, disappeared after the 1955 military coup. Some former agents claimed they were destroyed by direct order of officials loyal to the general to prevent them from falling into the hands of the new rulers. Others suggested that part of the material was transferred to army warehouses and later destroyed in the 1970s during the dictatorship. The Migration Archive, however, retained partial traces. In the late 1990s, a researcher gained limited access to its internal sections, known as pulgas and chila. In the first, a dilapidated, dust and moisture-filled storage area, he found thousands of orange folders containing passenger names and disembarkation lists spanning half a century of history. In the second, more organized section, personal files of every immigrant who entered the country between the 1920s and 1970s were stored. Among them were references confirming identical entry patterns for known war criminals. The files of Priebke and Mengele were numbered consecutively, 211,712/48 and 211,713/48. The coincidence proved their permits were processed simultaneously in 1948 by a common intermediary. The proximity to other cases, such as that of the Croatian Josef Schwamberger, reinforced the existence of a coordinated system operating from Europe under Carlos Fuldner's supervision. The discovery provided documentary support for what had until then been a general suspicion. The Nazi rescue network functioned as an institutional program. The Argentine delegation in Europe, led by priests and diplomats linked to the Vatican, processed the applications. In Buenos Aires, the Information Bureau and the Migration Office handled their legalization. Each file included copies of ecclesiastical recommendations and marginal notes about good references or no criminal record, despite the names appearing on Allied lists of wanted criminals. When the researcher attempted to directly consult these documents, the response was a firm refusal. His request caused discomfort among the agency's officials, who accused him of conducting a political investigation. Shortly afterward, he was summoned by the Migration Commissioner, Hugo Franco, a long-serving official in Peronist governments with ties to conservative sectors of the church. In a private interview, Franco denied the existence of any records predating his tenure. He admitted that prior documentation was a problem and hinted that he would prefer to destroy it entirely. Days later, an official statement assured that the files had not been destroyed and that access would be granted. But when the researcher returned, accompanied by representatives from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a lawyer from the agency quietly admitted that the most sensitive files had been burned in 1996 during a nighttime operation behind the building. In that fire, the entry records of Eichmann, Mengele, Priebke, and other Reich fugitives were allegedly destroyed. The account was corroborated by several employees. Some recalled the verbal order to dispose of everything that caused embarrassment. Others mentioned that the fire was set at the back of the premises, near the docks where immigrant ships had arrived for decades. The elimination was so thorough that no official record of the incineration remained. The documents vanished without an inventory or destruction report. The policy of concealment had extended into the final years of the 20th century. Soon after, the archive's own custodian warned that a new general cleanup was planned under the pretext of turning the building into a museum. To halt the measure, he contacted the press. In January 1999, the newspaper Pagina 12 published a report that forced authorities to temporarily suspend the destruction. Media pressure saved part of the collection, but only briefly. In 2001, when investigations resumed, the shelves in the Pulgas section were empty. The orange folders had disappeared, along with the possibility of tracing the movements of those who had made Argentina their refuge. Official accounts never provided an explanation. Some officials cited physical deterioration, others, internal reorganization. But the pattern was clear. Whenever a document could link the state to the protection of Nazis, it ceased to exist. The destruction of the archives completed, in the realm of memory, what the evasion network had begun half a century earlier, ensuring that history remained fragmented, without evidence to implicate those responsible. Although much of the records on the Nazi refuge network were destroyed in Argentina, significant traces remained in foreign archives. In Switzerland, the Federal Archives in Bern hold documents confirming the involvement of local officials in the transit of more than 300 Germans to South America. In Belgium, the papers of the collaborator Pierre Day, split between the Museum of Literature and the Center for World War II Studies, detail communications with Perón's circle and describe his role in receiving Reich exiles. In Argentina, scattered references still exist in police and military records, where a consistent pattern emerges, that of a bureaucratic system that meticulously documented even its most covert operations. This administrative obsession generated a vast number of documents. Public employees, trained in a rigid management model, followed procedures with precision, even in cases requiring discretion. Every foreigner needed a file that began with a disembarkation permit request, processed at an Argentine consulate or by an intermediary in Buenos Aires. For Third Reich fugitives, a simple letter signed by someone linked to the Information Bureau was enough to secure approval. Once issued, the permit was communicated by telegram to the corresponding consulate, where agents of Bishop Alois Hudal or the Croatian priest Krunoslav Draganovic collected the document on behalf of the applicant. With the permit in hand, those interested obtained a Red Cross travel document under the already registered false identity. These papers, originally intended for undocumented refugees, were internationally accepted as passports. From then on, they could apply for an Argentine visa, which was usually granted without further review. At times, consuls refused to issue it, or immigration allowed passengers to enter without a visa, revealing the internal disorder between the Foreign Ministry and the Immigration Office. In most cases, however, the procedures were completed without obstacles, and the beneficiaries also received a provisional certificate to obtain a police identity card upon arrival in Buenos Aires. The procedure included an additional stage in Italy. Perón had established the Argentine immigration delegation in Europe there, with offices in Rome and Genoa. This organization, with semi-diplomatic status, finalized the paperwork for those who already had a visa and landing permit. In Genoa, Argentine doctors examined the applicants and validated their documentation before boarding. The control was formal but flexible when it came to individuals recommended by the ecclesiastical network or Carlos Fuldner's agents. The resulting files were sent to Buenos Aires and recorded at the Immigration Directorate, where a numbered dossier was opened for each case. During 1948, at the height of European immigration, up to 500 new files were opened daily. Faced with the saturation, the government delegated part of the process to representatives of foreign communities with political affinity. Many of these intermediaries were former Axis collaborators hired as advisors. Their role was to fill immigrant quotas and ensure that no Jewish or communist applicants were included. The system combined legality and discretion. All documents bore official stamps, but ideological screening was conducted off the record. One such file, numbered 87902/47, survived because it was archived in the Foreign Ministry. It corresponds to the entry of former Yugoslav Prime Minister Milan Stojadinovic, arranged by Gino Monti de Valsacina, a member of the Information Bureau. In March 1947, Monti requested the permit directly from Commissioner Santiago Peralta, who ordered the Argentine consulate in London to approve the entry with any available documentation. Objections from Washington delayed the process, but in September of the same year, it was reactivated by Perón's order. Stojadinovic arrived in Buenos Aires in April 1948 with his family and integrated into the president's political circle. The case illustrates the administrative functioning of the network. Personal recommendations, diplomatic visas, ecclesiastical intervention, and sanitary validation culminated in a formal entry. This scheme, repeated with Eichmann, Mengele, Schwamberger, and Priebke, turned immigration procedures into an effective tool for concealment. The archives documenting this process were nearly erased, but their structure was reconstructed from the few surviving dossiers and scattered records in Europe.